Hey there, business builders. Today we're kicking off a new series on effective communication, where we decode the essential role communication plays in helping us achieve our business objectives. We'll focus on improving our communication skills, exploring the foundations of effective communication, and today we're benchmarking our current skills to identify areas for development throughout the series. Well, welcome to the Business Builders Podcast. We are your hosts. I am Brenton Gowland.
And I'm Ron Tomlin.
And Ron, we've just come to the end of our Life-Work Balance series, and we had Tim Bishop here, and he was great talking about mental health. What did you think of that?
That was fantastic. Yeah, to hear it from somebody who's been through it and is helping others get through it, it just gave such clarity to the importance of looking after your mental health and leaning on others to do that.
Yeah, I thought Tim was remarkably honest. I was really impressed with the fact that he's now got so comfortable talking about it, because it's very difficult for people to talk about their mental health until, and this is the interesting thing, until you actually start to talk about your mental health. Because I've found that when we normalize talking about mental health, and I've done the same thing myself, got honest about that in the past, and this was a while back, it then makes it much easier to talk about.
Well, think about when we talk about our physical health. People say, how are you feeling? Oh, I've got a bit of a cold at the moment. Or, oh, I sprained my ankle and I'm really hobbling around. We don't have any problems talking about that. In fact, we quite like talking about that. But when it comes to mental health.
So you've met my mother. I love my mum, but every time I ring her, I'm like, hi, how are you, mum? And she's like, oh, Brenton, I've got a problem. I'm not so good. My hip is really hurting. And look, to be fair, she does have aches and pains, but I hear about it a lot. So I'm very comfortable hearing about that from my mum.
There you go. A case in point. But we don't talk about feeling sad. We don't talk about our mental health in general. Maybe some people do, but I've found that people, especially in business contexts, tend to steer away from that sort of thing very easily. And it's not right. We should be comfortable talking about that type of thing without burdening others.
I agree. Now I'm going to give my mum a tick of credit. My mum does talk about her mental health when she has a problem, but we talked about this with Dr. Samantha Young during the Life-Work Balance series. And that is, my mum will say when she's not doing right in her thinking, and she's actually developed mechanisms to cope with that. And part of it is talking with other people about it. So tick, mum. I might hear about her aches and pains a lot, but tick that she does that, because I want to have her around in
modeling
another 10 or 20 years when she's going to be getting towards 100.
Oh my! No, let's not go there. That's
I want my mum to live past 100. I reckon she will. Anyway, we were going to have a nutritionist and a physical trainer. Now, we haven't quite got there yet, so we may have a hangover from the Life-Work Balance series in the next few episodes. You've got a
nutritionist, dietitian, I think, on the line.
On the line?
Yeah. But
those two people have been the hardest we've had to find.
Yeah. Well, I think the difficulty is finding someone who understands the business context.
Yes.
Yeah. So that might be our Achilles heel.
Okay. So in the course of the next series we do, you'll probably get a couple of little inserts from the Life-Work Balance series. And if you've been a keen listener of the Business Builders podcast, you'll realize that we've had a very slow start to the year, and it's mostly been because of other commitments, but we're now back on track. We're going to have this 2-week cadence back for the rest of the year, hopefully. And we're starting with a new series today. And Ron, our topic is communication.
Effective communication. Yes.
So can you talk to us about how we got to communication?
Well, one of the things you and I do on a regular basis, maybe not regular enough, is look at what we've done in the past, recognizing that people can go back and listen to podcasts. So one of the things we've done is looked at what is missing, where can we go? And it occurred to me that the only time we've really touched on communication to a large extent is the podcast we did on the importance of storytelling.
That was all about brand way back in the day.
Yeah. And we've talked about branding and so on, which
that in our first year, series 1?
Yes, it was.
Well, series 1, season 1.
Season 1. So under those circumstances, it jumped out like a deer in headlights. Or maybe that's the wrong analogy to use, but it became very clear that communication was something we really haven't tackled to a large extent. And once you open that Pandora's box, communication suddenly becomes this, in a business context, becomes so broad that I think it warrants a series to talk about why is this important and what are the aspects of communication that business leaders, business builders should be thinking about in terms of their practice as people who are building their businesses.
Agreed, 100%. And communication is such a broad topic. Humans operate almost exclusively on being able to communicate and interact with that outside world. So we were talking about the fact that we have 5 senses to help us navigate the world around us, the environment that we're in. And those senses are sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. So 5. And when you think about it, those 5 senses enable us to get data and understand the environment around us. Those senses communicate to us what's going on. I do this thing with businesses and their staff sometimes where I talk about effective communication, the difference between poor communication and effective communication. And I use a comparison between Helen Keller. So you remember who Helen Keller was?
Yeah, hearing impaired and sight impaired, or blind and deaf.
She, I think at a very young age, got an infection and it sent her blind and deaf.
Mm-hmm.
So she removed those 2 senses. And we talk about that when senses go, that the others take over. But you think about it as a young child, losing your ability to see and your ability to hear. She had to interpret what was going on around her from her parents and so forth, like the interactions was all through touch predominantly. And she would not understand what was going on and lash out at people and be very aggressive. And so they had to be equally strong with her to be able to care for her and love her until, of course, the nurse came along and helped her learn to communicate. And it was all through touch, and a lot of time was spent there. I suppose smell as well. You think, wow, that she had this perception of the world that was marred. And then we, as able-bodied people, we get to see so much more clearly. And I liken when we don't communicate effectively with people, we leave them in a similar position to where Helen Keller was, where she was left to interpret the world around her, what was going on, without all the correct information. And therefore, she got aggressive and she struck out. And so in a business sense, if we don't communicate effectively and we leave a whole heap of things that are left on the table that we haven't made clear, the people are left to interpret what's going on for themselves. And sometimes that means they'll get completely the wrong idea. So effective communication becomes really, really important. If you want people to really clearly understand what's going on and be on the same page as you and going in the same direction, and you want to be able to see your business grow, people got to very clearly understand what's going on. You can't leave them in that position of being marred in their senses and not communicating effectively, because when you are in the fog, like Helen Keller was, you're left to join the dots yourself. And effective communication says, I will help you join the dots in the correct fashion so that you understand clearly what's going on. Is that was a long-winded way of saying communication is really important, and we got 5 senses to work with.
Yeah, and there's the opportunity to use those 5 senses, but there are 2 predominant senses that come to the fore, hearing and sight, that even though we interpret the world around us mainly through those senses, people aren't necessarily all that adept at thinking about how people will use those senses to gain an appreciation of the world around them. And what I'm talking about there is we talk about communication, and it is the basis of relationships and therefore the basis of any business. But people make assumptions because it's something that is so intuitive, so ingrained in us, we often don't think about it too much. I mean, we don't, as an example, don't think about our breathing very much. It just happens. It's autonomic in that sense. But communication, I think we treat the same way. Oh yeah, I know how to speak to people. I know how to listen to people. I know how to write to people. And I don't think we think enough about what it's like on the other side, even though we're often on the other side for other people. And our default is, if we don't understand what's going on, they're a bad communicator. What about us? how good a communicator are we? And at the end of this podcast, I'm going to take you through a little exercise where you're going to consider how good a communicator you are. And people can do that while they're listening to the podcast at the end, because it's important that we get some self-awareness about what are the things that we want to improve in our communication. What are the obstacles or what are the roadblocks to us becoming better communicators? And the one that's obvious, if I were to say to you, what's one of your greatest fears in business? Or you talk to other people, their greatest fears in business, what would it be?
Public speaking.
Absolutely. Now the truth of the matter is, there shouldn't be any problems with public speaking because it's a form of communication, but it is a fear for people. And we'll cover that in the podcast.
I heard something once that
in this series.
Yeah. Sorry for cutting you off, but I heard once that the fear of public speaking is more than that of dying.
For a lot of people, it is. It is. Because I suppose dying is final. Public speaking, the embarrassment can go on for years.
And you're here to experience it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so why are we so fearful of scenarios like that where we have to get up in front of a group of people? Another one is conflict. Why do we find conflict so difficult? We should be quite good at it. We should at least have mechanisms available to deal with conflictual situations when we're trying to communicate, and yet people have fears about it. And I think part of it is we avoid. And if we keep avoiding those situations, we don't get good at it. There's one way to get better at public speaking, do more public speaking.
Yeah, so you were talking about public speaking, but let's take it right back to a normal business sense. How do I navigate a meeting?
One-to-one speaking, one-to-many speaking, many-to-one speaking. And this is another aspect that I'd like to cover in the series is when we talk about communication, the immediate connotation is I've got to get what's in my head out to someone else, right? But the truth of the matter is effective communication involves first understanding who I'm talking to and the context in which I'm speaking, or I want to get my communication out, and that's listening. And the whole art of questions, using questions to listen more effectively, is something that I don't think is well understood, and I think we need to cover in this series as well.
So there's a lot to talk about. I've just thought of a definition for why communication is so important. You know how we said that our senses help us navigate the environment around us? I think effective communication helps us navigate our business environment effectively, something like that. Effective communication helps us to navigate effectively in our day-to-day lives and our business world. I'll think about that because I reckon there's some sort of definition here for what we're doing that could be quite good. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. Using the analogy of a radar, our communication two-way is our sonar for navigating business situations.
Well, and it's interesting because earlier you talked about our sight and our hearing being some of our principal communication tools, but what are they? And I'll caveat that with, you haven't mentioned our ability to speak yet. So you've talked about eyes and ears. What do?
They take in information and they
well, no. You just highlighted listening. Eyes and ears, particularly eyes and ears smell, touch, pretty much everything. And our mouth is not a sense. All of our senses are for receiving. Think about that. The speaking, the ability to speak is not a sense. It's an ability we have to be able to communicate. But all those receptors that we were talking about help us to listen only. So that highlights the importance of our whole body. All of our senses are about listening. And one thing, well, actually not one thing, we'll talk about that later because there's body language, all that kind of stuff. But our ability to speak and the ability to move our body and to dress our body and to look a certain way, the way we look, the way we speak are what we communicate to other people. But all of the senses of a human being are to do with listening. That should speak volumes.
Well, there's the old adage, you have one mouth, two ears. So when you're communicating, use it in that proportion. I'm not a great fan of those simplicity. I think, to my way of thinking, it's 90% about listening and listening with all those senses.
Yeah.
And it's 1% getting your message across and thinking about how you get your message across. So in this series, we'll talk about things like persuasion, navigating difficult conversations, nonverbal communication, crisis communication, because that becomes incredibly important for
Massively
business.
important.
Yeah. Building a brand through communication, digital communication, because that's now a new medium that wasn't available before. But
Not sure if we can call it new anymore.
well, maybe. Okay, that's a medium. Cultural sensitivity and global communication, because whether we like it or not, there are different cultures and we need a sensitivity to those cultures. And what we communicate through that cultural lens is not always the way we want it to be unless we have that sensitivity. Listening. I definitely want to do an entire podcast on that. Public speaking. And I've got some people that I'm already thinking about. We can get on and talk about that. And let's get Craig Rispin back to talk about the future of communication and business.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
If you're not aware who that is, go back a few episodes and we had futurist Craig Rispin come and talk to us about the future, not just AI, but about where things are going. Everything from, I think he was talking about nanotechnology, where we use organic matter as storage, through to, of course, the evolution of AI, which we're all in the midst of at the moment.
So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this series. But what I'd like to do as part of that is start with something that our listeners can do, and I'm going to use you as a guinea pig.
I love being a guinea pig, Ron.
Okay. So let's do a self-assessment tool, just 10 questions in 4 categories.
Yep.
Those 4 categories are listening, clarity and conciseness, empathy and understanding, and response quality. Okay, so I'll take you through this. Now, what I'd like you to do, and what I'd like our listeners to do, is get a piece of paper and a pen out, and just on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is strongly disagree or very poor, and 10 is strongly agree or excellent, depending on the question, to rate themselves.
So this is a benchmarking exercise.
This is a benchmarking exercise.
Excellent. And
what I'm going to challenge our listeners to do is, when we start this series, benchmark yourself. And then as you listen to the series, and hopefully at the end of the series, benchmark yourself again and see if, as a result of what we've talked about, you've improved your communication skills.
Okay.
So let's get started.
I've got my keyboard, so I will keep track of, how many questions are there?
10.
Right, okay.
So it's going to be really easy to do a rating for yourself overall. Yeah.
So you just want me to give the answer? You want me to give any narrative?
Just give me a score from 1 to 10.
Okay.
Okay. So statement number 1. When someone else is speaking to me, I focus fully on what they're saying without formulating my response until they've finished speaking. Scale of 1 to 10.
I am going to give a bit of narrative on this. I'm going to give myself a 7 on this. If you had asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said about a 3. This has been I'm an extrovert. My partner is an introvert. I have improved a lot because I've had to, and it's made a huge difference. But I now actively think about this when I'm talking to people, think about listening.
So 7.
So I'm going to give myself a 7.
Okay.
That's been a huge progression for me over the years.
Excellent. Number 2, I notice nonverbal cues such as body language and tone of voice to understand the speaker's emotions and intentions.
Oh, that's hard. I've improved in that again, but I would say, I'm going to say 6, because that's something I really need to work on.
Put down 6. Number 3, I ask questions for clarification or further information when I'm listening to someone speak.
I'm going to give myself an 8 for that, because I'm reasonably good, but I know I can improve because I have a special someone in my life who tells me when I'm not asking questions.
Very good. Okay, clarity and conciseness. Question number 4. I express my thoughts and ideas clearly and directly using appropriate language for my audience.
Pause, because there's a lot to think about here. I use appropriate language for my audience, but sometimes I think as I speak. This is me understanding myself. So if you catch me at the top of that cycle where I haven't thought about a topic before, I'd say I'd be in the 4s or 3s because I'm all over the place. But once I've had time to process, I'm really good. So I'll give myself a 6 for that.
Okay. Number 5, I'm able to condense complex information into a concise summary that is understandable for others.
That I'm very good at. So I'll give myself an 8 for that because that's part of my job.
Okay, empathy and understanding. This is question 6. I make an effort to understand things from the other person's perspective during a conversation.
Yeah, 8, definitely.
Okay. Number 7, I recognize and appropriately respond to others' emotions during a conversation.
No, I'm good at that. I will actually give myself a 9 for that.
Okay. 9. Wow. You're in touch with your feminine side.
Possibly.
That's very good. Okay. Response quality. These are the last 3 questions. My responses in conversation are thoughtful and add value to the discussion.
8.
9. I provide constructive feedback and positive reinforcement when appropriate in conversations.
9.
Okay. I am comfortable with and capable of adapting my communication style to suit different situations and people. 9. Okay.
I've been called a chameleon before.
Well, there you go. Now, you add up those 10 questions. So all you got to do is add up and divide by 10.
Okay, give me a moment. Thinking time here.
Mm-hmm.
So 7.8.
7.8. Okay, so to interpret your score, if you're 1 to 3, you're in the emerging communication skills category. You've got significant improvement required, and you've got a road ahead of you, but at least you know that now. If you're 4 to 6, you're developing communication skills effectively, but there are areas for improvement, and you can look back and see what those are. If you're in 7 to 9,
which is me,
wow,
7.8. I'm just
you're
in the
a proficient
cusp.
Communicator. You've got minor improvements, and you can see where those minor improvements are. Maybe
well, it is part of my job to be a communicator, so maybe I shouldn't be too surprised.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Maybe in the listening side of things, I would say, from what your responses
definitely
were. Yeah. And if you're 10, which means you got 10 on everything,
you're a savant.
Yeah, well, you're an excellent communicator already, and you probably are a little bit, how would I say, not self-aware, because I suspect anyone who marked themselves as 10 for all those things, I'd be a little bit suspicious of.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you these questions because we may as well both have a benchmark to start with. And listeners, if you're with us, get your pen and paper out. I'm going to ask these questions again, and we'll do this one quickly. I gave dialogue because I can't help myself because I'm a chatterbox. Rom, you can do what you want to do, but we'll start with the listening. So when someone is speaking to me, I fully focus on what they're saying without formulating my response until they've finished speaking.
6,
right. So the second question is, I notice nonverbal cues such as body language and tone of voice to understand the speaker's emotions and intentions.
7.
I ask questions for clarification or further information when I'm listening to someone speak.
8.
I express my thoughts and ideas clearly and directly using appropriate language for my audience.
7.
Listeners, how are you going? We're up to question 5. I am able to condense complex information into a concise summary that is understandable for others.
I would normally say something like a 7, but just someone recently told me that I waffle too much. So I'm going to say a 6.
Ooh. Empathy and understanding. I make an effort to understand things from the other person's perspective during a conversation.
Yeah, I'd say 7.
7. Question 7. I recognize and appropriately respond to others' emotions during a conversation.
5.
Really?
Yeah. I'm not, that's one of my weaknesses.
Yeah, okay. Question 8. My responses in conversations are thoughtful and add value to the discussion.
I'd say 7.
7. All right. I provide constructive feedback and positive reinforcement when appropriate in conversations.
8.
And last question. I am comfortable with and capable of adapting my communication style to suit different situations and people.
6.
6. All right. So you are 6.7.
I think I've got plenty of room for improvement.
Yeah, okay. So what's your goal? To get to a 7 by the end of this series?
Oh, I'd like to get it up to a 7.5.
7.5. So I'm going to put that down here is 7.5. 7.5 is your goal. I'm feeling the pressure here. I'd like to be an 8, but I'll put 8.2.
Yeah.
I do a lot of public speaking and all that kind of gear. I got comfortable with it years ago, so I still do a lot of thinking about that when I do a gig. I got some speaking gigs coming up shortly. So I know that communication is one of the things that I try to be good at. I mean, maybe our listeners should assess us from a outsider's perspective. I would never ask people to do that because I'd be afraid of what's going to come back.
Absolutely right. You could, and we'll talk about this, for instance, the fog index when we're talking about business writing.
Yeah. Well, the thing I talked about with Helen Keller is actually a workshop that I do with staff in different places, like to compare. Helen Keller was a child of this age who had these difficulties to deal with, and she ended up being a great writer. Go figure, right? So that just proves that anyone can improve, really. But I use that fog index that you were just talking about there. Are you going to be in the clear, effective communication, or are you going to be in the fog? And if we think about the fact that what we're trying to do here is improve the way we navigate the environment around us to achieve our goals. So I just progressed that definition I gave earlier, and it might be a business goal. It might be I want to do this, but to be able to communicate is our ability to persuade, our ability to see our dreams come to pass, to see our businesses grow. So communication, I think what we're trying to communicate here is vitally important in every function of our lives. So therefore, it really does require a bit of thinking. And if you're a business leader, you lead through communicating.
Well, you lead other people. And the only way to get your message across to other people, well, by definition, is communication. So your stock and trade is people. Your mechanism is communication.
I'm going to share a quick story about nonverbal communication. Just in finishing, I've been listening to this audiobook, and I always highly recommend listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks. I've been listening to this audiobook by a guy named William Goldman, who was a screenwriter in America. And I was listening to a marketer on, I think what it's called, the Marketing Meetup podcast. And this guy was talking and saying, look, if you're a creative writer, you'll get more out of listening to William Goldman talk about screenwriting than you'll potentially get listening to marketers talking about how to market your business to someone. And I thought, you know what? That's really interesting, because the heart of innovation is to take people in similar kind of places, but in different streams or different industries, and compare and look at what they're doing to see if I can get insights. And sure enough, I've been listening to this book called Adventures in the Screen Trade by William Goldman. And he was actually talking about Richard Attenborough directing A Bridge Too Far, a movie that was, I believe, in the 70s. I think Robert Redford was the lead star, and then Sean Connery was in it, and Laurence Olivier, and all these really big actors.
It was about the Second World War.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. It was basically about these joint forces were coming in to save these people who were trying to take these bridges, who got into a bit of strife, but they got to within 1 mile and they couldn't get any further. So the whole thing toppled. So it was a really interesting story, and a bit confronting, really, and a bit of a tragedy. But for authenticity, they wanted to use the actual bridges that were part of the story. So they wanted to use this bridge in Holland, and I forget the name of the place, and they called it the $1 Million Hour because they couldn't shut down this bridge for weeks of shooting. So they would give the bridge to them once a week on a Sunday for 1 hour between 8 and 9 a.m. That was the only time they could use it. And of course, Robert Redford was being paid a fortune, and they had hundreds of extras when doing these scenes. And they said the pressure on the director is so massive. And William Goldman was talking about the fact that Richard Attenborough could not show the stress he was under, because if you showed the stress or the fact that you weren't in complete control of everything that was going on, the whole thing could fall apart. And you've got 1 hour to shoot these massive scenes. This was their last weekend with the last day. Look, long story short, they got it done. But he talked about how Richard Attenborough had these ways of conducting himself that when the pressure was on, he would start whistling. And he would walk in these concentric circles that meant nothing to anyone else but himself. But he would always keep his demeanor upbeat and positive. And in the midst of all that was going on, he was able to instill a confidence in all the people around him. That is communication. That is a leader communicating. And we could look at all sorts of examples of that. But communication is so important in everything you do. And as a leader, as business leaders, the eyes are on us all the time, not in the things that we necessarily say and do, but in all of our actions.
Well, the interesting thing is people talk about communication as a conscious thing, but the truth of the matter is we're communicating whether we like it or not. Whether the message we're getting across is the one we want or not depends on our capacity to control our communication in all its varied form.
So for those of you who are listening, this series that we're starting right now is on effective communication, and we want you to do the benchmark test that we just went through. And we want to see if by the end of this series, we can shift the dial on our communication skills from wherever you're at. I'm at a 7.8, Ron's at a 6.7. We want to shift the dials in a northerly direction to see if we can improve our skills and navigate our business environment with greater skill. There you go.
So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me, and we look forward to talking with you in a couple of weeks.
Communicating with you.
Well, we look forward to communicating with you about our topic on effective communication. Goodbye.